Matty, good to see you. Everybody else, thanks for joining today. Got a nice crowd. Looking forward to hearing all of your questions from the audience. Matty, how are you?
I'm good, Nate. Appreciate it. How are you doing?
Pretty well. A little under the weather, but maybe with the weather because of the current drama with Tornado Cash and everything like that. It's been a
Yeah.
wild couple of days.
Yeah, this Tornado Cash stuff, I mean, it doesn't get as much attention as the SEC headlines, but it's the more existential risk, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think anytime Tornado Cash or anything like it is in the news, I feel like I drop everything, and all of crypto Twitter really drops everything and just focuses entirely on that it becomes the only topic.
Yeah, that's fair. For good reason.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things I wanted to talk about today, and I guess it's come up first. So, I want to give you a quick intro for everybody that's listening, and then maybe we'll launch into that. I'm really excited to have Matty here today. Matty is one of the foremost tokenomics intellectuals, architects, whatever term we're using to describe ourselves. And Matty has a book coming out this week. It's going to be the first of its kind, called Tokenomics for Builders, and it's going to be a primer. And Matty, I'll let you describe this, but the way I describe it is as a primer on all things tokenomics that's going to give people a really in-depth view into what tokenomics is and how to apply it in practice. So really excited to have you here today, Matty, and looking forward to asking you some questions and getting some questions from the audience. If anyone has questions that's listening in, feel free to drop those in one of the tweets, and then we'll see those, get a notification, and we're feel free to request and come up on stage and ask directly.
Yeah, appreciate that, Nate. Yeah, just really briefly to speak to that. So, releasing it open source tomorrow. So, you say book, and it is quite a substantial guide, but it's not. This is not for sale. This is just an open source community resource that I've been compiling for a while. I noticed. I'll give a little bit more background of myself in a second, but I noticed when I was working with teams at an accelerator that a lot of them, a Web3 accelerator, a lot of them were dealing with the same questions about tokenomics, about their models, as simple as, how much supply should we give, how much portion should we give to the team, right? But as complex as how do we, optimize for this given security function, right? Or make sure that this governance mechanism it will behave as we expect, right? And so there's a lot of pieces to tokenomics, and I realized that teams don't have a go-to resource for helping them formulate all these thoughts. And so I put together this guide. It's largely broken down into two sections. The first section is a more descriptive, why does tokenomics matter? What is tokenomics? Does every project need a token with checklists to help founders think through, is a token the best fit for them? Even if it is a fit for them, is it a fit for right now, right? Which is a separate question. And then it gets into there's a few other topics, but then it gets into part two, which is really a step-by-step process with frameworks that dozens or more teams have used at this point, frameworks, methodologies, models, quantitative models in Python, spreadsheets, everything builders should need to go from pretty much scratch to having a very solid draft of every aspect of their tokenomics that's not necessarily you're not going to be able to launch the token tomorrow, right? There's a lot of still work and auditing and writing smart contracts, but it would be definitely enough to start to publish, client user-facing stuff to potentially raise investment. Now, obviously, before you launch a token or even speak about a token publicly, you'll always want to speak to a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer. None of this is, legal advice. But it was a lot of work and a lot of fun putting this guide together, and I hope it'll be helpful for builders in the space.
Incredible. There's so much value there, and as someone who understands tokenomics, and Matty is very familiar with your work, I'm awed at the amount of value you're going to be able to provide in this book, in this ebook for builders, and really excited for Friday when you release this publicly. So thanks for coming on to speak about it. And you mentioned something in there that I think is a great place to start, which is, what is tokenomics? I'm curious, how do you define tokenomics?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that is the key first question, right? I mean, I I first like to think about it, as you know, Nate, of defining what it's not, right? Like I have this the meme that I created of people saying, here's our pie chart and emissions graph, and okay, but you have the rest of your tokenomics, right? Um, People often use the word tokenomics to describe only the supply side elements of the token, right? Literally just like, what's the max supply number, right? Like how much is allocated to investors and team, and there's your tokenomics. And that is an element of tokenomics, but it's far from a robust kind of holistic description. I prefer to think of tokenomics as the set of monetary and governance or non-monetary rules that a protocol employs, really to the purpose of incentivizing user behavior or user coordination for a specific goal. That to me is a better definition of tokenomics.
Love that definition, and very holistic. And I appreciate and like that you also distinguish between supply side and demand side in tokenomics, because just having a scarce supply is not enough to drive value. It's not enough to get people to coordinate in a particular way. And so I really appreciate that distinction that you make.
Yeah, and I know your ETH Denver talks and et cetera. I mean, I'm a big fan of how you frame it, of focusing on demand side tokenomics. I think that's definitely a narrative that will become more popular, perhaps in the next bull market, when or perhaps throughout this bear market, as teams realize that more sustainable, more mature tokenomics is going to be likely necessary, with some exceptions. There's always exceptions, but going to be more the expectation of this next class of crypto users that are a bit more educated, have learned some painful lessons in the past.
That's our goal, and I think that is an open question whether degens really learn, but it seems to be trending. It seems to be trending in that direction. So we're really looking forward to seeing demand side tokenomics as a concept catch on, and I'm looking forward to seeing your iterations on that in this book that's coming out Friday. So to get back to what we started talking about in the topic du jour, Tornado Cash. There's a lot to say and there's a lot to not say, so I won't put you in any compromising positions, but I'm curious what you think of the implications are for tokenomics, for the space more broadly, or just in general. Feel free to freeverse, but the implications of this arrest yesterday and some of the allegations that are coming.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's not great for privacy builders in particular. I think one of the real true promises of a lot of these pieces of technology is censorship resistant, right? Private communication, interactions, finance, everything, generalized, abstracted interactions. And this is definitely a blow to that in general. I think finding the developers themselves, right, who have written open source code, as responsible for what the software, or basically how users have used that software, is a very nuanced and there's nuanced conversation there, right? Because if you write code that only has the purpose of, doing something nefarious, if this code only can be used for illegal activity, that's perhaps one thing. But I think there are plenty of reasonable, legitimate cases for preserving privacy, that it's not illegal or not even used for illegal activity or by criminals to use a Tornado Cash or a mixer service. And so you get into this very slippery slope where you start extrapolating, well, just because this thing could be used illegally, now you're responsible personally for what other people do with it, right? So are we going to start holding every inventor accountable for how their invention is used? It's a rather terrifying precedent, especially in the context of builders who are trying to build tools that allow for preserving privacy and censorship resistance.
Definitely. Yeah, I like the analogies that have come up in the last few days. I saw one by Eric Voorhees. We could get rid of all criminals if we just required licenses for breathing and denied them to those who offend. And I think it's a great parody and a great example as well of the ways that this kind of precedent could be used in dangerous ways to criminalize all sorts of technology that might be used in ways that are unfavorable to existing institutions. And so I appreciate your take on that and your thoughts on that. I'm sure everyone else in the space does as well. This is the news of the day, the topic du jour. So to shift gears a little bit back toward tokenomics, as a general question, what would you say are like the most important aspects of tokenomics, or what are those important truths that you recognize that other people don't often see? We hit on a couple of them with demand side tokenomics, but what are the other things that you wish people would pay more attention to?
Yeah, I mean, demand-side tokenomics is definitely a key summary of the things that people are missing. I mean, because as we started this conversation with, like, oftentimes people define tokenomics in the absence of demand entirely, only considering supply-side aspects. So definitely, even just starting to think about demand aspects, incentives, use cases, utilities. But I really think if I had to pick one thing, it's difficult. I guess I'll skip out and pick two things. I think value accrual, right? How does the token accrue value? This itself is a part of a chain of events, right? The product has to create value, right? Users need to be willing and able to use this product and willing to pay for it, or at least pay gas fees to use it. The product or protocol has to capture a portion of that value, right, as protocol revenues or as burning tokens, whatever that looks like. There's different ways to do that. And then the value has to accrue to the token. The token itself has to, in other words, benefit from some of this value capture. There's cases of tokens that, there's cases of products that don't create value in the first place, right? So maybe you can bribe people to use the product for a little while, but then no one actually uses the product or plays the game because they enjoy it, and then it just drops off a cliff as soon as hyperinflation sets in. There's products that create value but don't capture it. Currently, Uniswap is an example of this, right? Lots of value created, but the protocol itself doesn't actually capture any fee or revenue. And then there's products and tokens that create value and capture value, but the value that's captured is kind of like totally unrelated or orthogonal to the token itself, right? Like DYDX is a popular example of this, where there's fees being captured, but the fees go to this private entity, and the token is kind of just like token holders are just kind of left. That John Travolta from Pulp Fiction meme, like looking around, not really trying to figure out what's going on. So that's one piece, value accrual, and then the other one would be just incentives, right? Like the whole beauty of tokenomics, token emissions, is aligning incentives, and so little thought relatively is spent on thinking through incentives, thinking through how they can be warped, how they can be abused, how can they be exploited, rather than just the basic, should I give 5% to this guy? Like, should emissions be 2 years or 5 years? There's so much more richness on the demand side elements than some of these supply side elements.
Love that characterization of tokenomics as it's sort of like something, maybe a phrase I often use, is the alignment of incentives in a protocol. And I think those are so often overlooked. I'm curious, why do you think it is that builders overlook all of these incentives and focus so much more on the code?
I think because they're engineers, right? Like I've been a technical co-founder myself, and I mean, when you when you're passionate about stuff, you like creating stuff, like that's what you tend to focus on, right? And just like Web 2 technical founders can kind of sometimes um, make the mistake of launching a product because it's cool or because they like to build it and not because there's a market need for it. It's a similar dynamic at play with people. They built this really cool technology, but then they just don't really give it nearly as much time or thought to the token, treat the token as this kind of like experiment. And inevitably, I mean, you're in finance said it best, like they launched their Wi-Fi token. It was given away, in a so to speak, fair launch, given away entirely for free, right? 100% of the supply given away for free, but still token holders ended up angry about like, well, when are you going to deliver this, right? Why is the price going down, right? When's the next feature? So I think builders need to be much more intentional about launching a token, because it's no exaggeration, even though it sounds absurd, that even if you give the token away 100% for free, there is going to be a cost, there is a downside, there is a risk. At the very least, it's going to represent a substantial distraction from actually being able to work on your day-to-day product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably accurate. As engineers are more focused on the really exciting idea they have, and they're excited to put it into practice, and oftentimes they're not considering the what I would call like the economic side of this cryptocurrency design of these protocols. And a sort of a thread that I've been thinking about recently is how Satoshi was both an economist and a developer, and you
Yeah.
need both skill sets to really build a protocol that's going to last the next 100 years. Otherwise, it's there's going to be some flaw in the system design, like we've been seeing with a lot of governance exploits, with some system design flaws. Tornado Cash itself had one of those recently, and liquidity exploits, Oracle manipulation. There are all sorts of ways that this can go wrong, where developers might code things perfectly. They might translate the system requirements into the most elegant smart contract code that you can imagine, but still, because they didn't have those economic incentives in mind, like you work on, they weren't able to properly align the incentives of the protocol in a way that lets it last for the remainder of civilization's existence or use of these blockchain applications.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I think that's well said. I think it's one thing to design technology that works in theory, forever, because code, at least on the blockchain, largely doesn't change. But yeah, I mean, especially when you're talking about some of the timelines that some of these projects have in mind. Even just look, you're talking about years, decades, centuries. I mean, it is incredibly difficult to anticipate shocks to systems even weeks, days ahead of time, let alone years and decades. So you really need to be intentionally thinking through anti-fragility, robust incentives, right? Things that are optimized for the long term, rather than just what'll get you, this pump and dump type of thing to get users off the ground. I mean, you can see why there's an incentive to do that, right? Especially through these earlier cycles, like there was a financial reward to launch these projects that were doomed from the start, but just used inflationary, Ponzi-nomic, or other kind of misleading marketing tactics to draw people in, pump up the price, and then the ding was doomed from the start. It never could be sustainable, and then it drops, but early comers and insiders still made a fortune. So hopefully, other than external regulators stepping in, like tying it together with the Tornado Cash conversation, the only other mechanism I can see for preventing that, or at least reducing the prevalence, is for the industry itself to be somewhat self-regulating and policing. Right? There are analogies for this in traditional finance, right? Like FINRA, that is a organization you might have heard of before, a regulatory organization that's actually it's an industry organization. It's not an official. It plays a regulatory role, but it is not a government body. It's an industry from the financial regulation. Excuse me. It is a it is a organization from the financial industry itself. And so I think a similar type of role could come about in blockchain and crypto, especially with regard to token economics. And I think things like, economic audits and not just smart contract audits kind of could play a role in that.
Definitely. That's one thing that we're hoping to see is greater attention to the quality of these incentives and the alignment of these incentives through things like economic security assessments or other services that private organizations are providing, because as we've seen with government institutions, those aren't even enough to prevent large scale systemic risks and economic crises where there was plenty of regulation before 2008, but people find ways around the regulation because there's a financial incentive. And governments are often not in the position to truly prevent those kinds of things from happening because governments are made up of individuals, and these individuals see opportunities for profit as well. And so they're complacent to take a cut of the kind of criminal activity that is happening. And so it's actually not a solution just to have a government institution. One of my hopes for crypto is that we find private replacements to these institutions. And to your point, I think Consumer Reports and Moody's, two separate domains, but both examples of private institutions that regulate behavior in financial markets to the benefit of consumers. So I love that point that we may see something, and I think we will. We likely will, and I'd imagine that's something you're looking at as well, as you're thinking about evaluating economic security and these kinds of incentives. Is that a service that you provide? Is that something you're looking into?
Yeah, I mean, definitely like thinking through these, economic risks and security is definitely an aspect of what I do. My day-to-day role at Status and Logos, which are two projects with launching tokens that are focused on censorship resistance and privacy. So the Tornado Cash definitely hits home. But yeah, definitely something I think through and focus on. I think that's a good point you make about like the external regulation. Anytime you have a regulator, that entity is essentially has this warped incentive to perpetuate the thing it is regulating. Otherwise, it regulates itself out of existence. And so you get these weird, twisted incentives where potentially, the Gary SBF stuff is like one ramification of that, right? Where he needs to justify his own existence and therefore ends up creating kind of like Batman and the Joker, almost an evil regulatory Batman and a worse Joker. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I love it. That's a great analogy. Yeah, it's the regulators are in a position to perpetuate the problem that ostensibly only they can solve.
Yeah,
love it. So we have another speaker just brought on stage, Octopus. If you want to ask Matty a question, go ahead. And if anyone else is interested in hearing Matty answer anything in particular, feel free to request the mic or post a tweet underneath one of ours. We'll see it, and we'll ask that question on your behalf. Octopus, go ahead.
Hi, Matty. I always appreciate your insight. Thank you for sharing your expertise. My question is, so lately I've been interested in trying to do some post-mortems on projects that failed to try to identify the causes. First of all, I want to know, do you think that's a good idea to sort of retrospectively look at the cause of failure? And secondly, one thing I'm having a little bit of difficulty doing is separating bad tokenomics from bad macroeconomics. Like, did this project fail because it just launched in the teeth of a sharp bear, or was there something fundamentally wrong with it? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on both of those things.
That's a great question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. To answer the first part of it, I do think that there's tremendous value, arguably more value, in studying projects that have gone wrong, right, than successful projects. I think studying, especially in the context of like stable coins, studying like what mechanisms have tried and just weren't sustainable or didn't work is very useful. That being said, one thing you do have to be wary of in that context is selection bias, right? if you only look at, if there's 10 protocols that tried something and you only look at the one that failed and the 9 others succeeded, you're obviously missing the larger picture. So you'd want to be careful to avoid selection bias by trying to be unbiased in first selecting what are you analyzing, right? Like, are we analyzing stable coins? Are we analyzing, under collateralized stable coins specifically? Are we analyzing AMM pool, like a thing, and then find all the peers before diving into like, okay, let's analyze this one, because you want to try and isolate the causes of failure and not just only consider the things that failed, which is, and then you'll just not be able to cross-reference, was this a common denominator or was this something unique to the ones that failed? So that's the selection bias piece of it. And then I think it kind of gets into, it's kind of related to the second part of that question, where anytime you try to attribute cause and effect to really anything in complex systems, it's incredibly hard to do so, because the scientific method is basically the only method that we have as humans, or the best one we found at least, of distinguishing between correlation and causation. And the scientific method requires you to basically repeat an experiment to test a specific hypothesis and change, maybe 1 or 2 things at a time, ideally 1 thing at a time, to see if that factor is the thing that causes the change. You can run simulations, but obviously you can't really run experiments with like life-size, huge real world protocols. You can only do after the fact analysis. So there's always going to be some risk of like misattributing things. It's very famous in the traditional finance world, where I started my career, that every single day, no matter what the stock market does, there's always some headline saying like, oh, stocks are up because China, invaded this country, or stock bonds are down because this guy sneezed, right? There's always some narrative published to try to explain what's happening. And we are humans. We are biased to try to find signals and narratives where there aren't ones. So it's just, you have to be careful to triangulate as much as possible to kind of approximate the scientific method of seeing like, okay, this one failed and it had a similar macroeconomic model or timing of what launched to these other 4 ones, but the only difference was this one factor of its token economics model. So maybe that explains the difference outcome, right? You're kind of trying to take the same principles of the scientific method and apply it retroactively. Never going to be quite as good, but that's kind of the best practice.
Absolutely. I think to speak to this kind of problem, I think, Matty, you've heard this as well. A lot of people probably come to you, they come to us and ask for how they should implement VE tokenomics in particular. And I want to shout out Dr. Nick before bringing him up on stage to ask a question and participate in this discussion. But I think VE tokenomics are a perfect example of why you can't just copy tokenomic mechanisms. It's the analogy I like to give is you wouldn't put the Falcon rocket booster on your car. It's a totally different mechanism. It's designed for a different purpose. And the case in point of VE tokenomics is, yes, Curve hasn't failed yet, but there is a massive, what Dr. Nick calls Ponzi queue, waiting to exit from the Curve tokens. And so I think VE tokenomics is a canonical example of not copy pasting mechanisms indiscriminately. And along those same lines, you can look at mechanisms that have worked out and haven't worked out across protocols, and that sort of scientific method type approach is probably the best way to do that. I totally agree with Matty on this one. Thanks for that question, Octopus, and bringing Dr. Nick up to ask a question and maybe weigh in on some of these things as well.
This space was downloaded via spacesdown.com. Visit to download your spaces today.
Hey, Nick, go ahead.
How's it going?
Good to see you.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation, guys. Thank you very much for doing this. Matty, I've not heard you talk about this, but I just agreed with everything you said.
Hey, you're a little muffled. I can barely make it out. Any chance you
really?
have a different mic? Octopus, also, you're still off mute.
How's this? Is that better?
Much
Oh,
better.
Do you know what it
better.
is?
Yeah, thanks.
AirPods Max, super fancy headphones, right? But if you put left ear on the right ear, that happens because the microphone's pointed the wrong way, pointing at the back of your head. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks so much for the conversation so far. Matty, I've not heard you talk before about this stuff, and I'm so excited for that resource you've created. Can't wait to see it. Absolutely needed. And I think that like I really support this idea of trying to like get people to have a more mature framing of token economics. Actually, just take it seriously. So I really like appreciated the conversation earlier about like the developer's position. Why don't people care about this stuff more? And it's largely they're just focused on the code and the product, right? And so we haven't got the basics right, in my view. So yes, it's the tokenomics is the pie chart and how it's all distributed. But we didn't get that right. Like even the most basic trust models weren't locked in, so people put the pie chart in, but they didn't actually commit to it, right? It's not on chain. So there's like the basics haven't been cracked yet. Yeah. So one of my questions is like, how do we get people to care about even the most basics of this? And like, what are the base building blocks of token economics that we think because for one, we need to mitigate the avalanche of rug pulls we get. So I'm interested in what your thoughts on how do we get people to care about it enough to find the importance in sorting out the base trust models of a token economy, and B, the bigger problem, which is around cornered token supplies. So you can have the best mechanism in the world and it doesn't get the best shot. So Octopus's question around the bear market's true, but actually the bear markets are generally created by VCs selling the token into the floor. So how do we make token economies better, and what are the sort of base units? That's my sort of core question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You hit on a key, like a phenomenal concept there, which is that even when these things are, well designed on paper, they're almost always or very rarely enforceable on chain, right? As you mentioned, which is kind of mind-boggling for an industry that is ostensibly trustless, decentralized, driven by on-chain decisions, driven purely by code. But then you have things like was it Arbitrum recently that had that governance vote of how some of the tokens should be spent, and then whoops, after the vote said no, don't spend these tokens, they revealed that they'd already gone ahead and done it anyway, and the vote was purely a retroactive kind of show of force. So I think it is a great point that what we have now is this disconnect between how even responsible builders or more detailed builders are describing how things work and then how enforceable those things actually are. And I don't think there's an easy answer, unfortunately, for closing that gap, because ultimately it requires people holding, these bullshitters accountable. And as long as people are just purely motivated by short-term profits or just, cycling through the next hype, the next narrative on what feels like, quicker and quicker timescales sometimes, it's hard to see what will change. I think there is some evidence of people getting more mature, but I think that is the role that, whether you like it or not, that is the role that regulation plays, or the beneficial aspect of the role that regulation plays in the real world, right, in the off-chain world. And I think we need to. It is an open question of how crypto in general can kind of unlock that benefit, that aspect of the benefit, this kind of like self-policing aspect, without involving censorship and centralization, and politics and all this sort of nonsense. I, for one, think a lot of it comes back down to just like individual responsibility, which is an ethos that a lot of crypto, Bitcoin itself, kind of is built on individual responsibility, but also collective holding people accountable, education, and some forms of industry regulation, for lack of a better phrase, right? Like industry practitioner organizations, DAOs. You wouldn't want to end up in a world where there's like some centralized party that is blessing, like, yes, this token gets my blessing to launch, right, and this project gets my blessing. But you can imagine some happy middle ground where people trust that this organization or decentralized entity community has long-term incentives to be truthful, altruistic incentives as well, and as long as they're not being bribed, should be reviewing projects in an honest way. And doesn't mean they're right 100% of the time, no, but they're at least providing this kind of like, similar to what Nate said, like these consumer reports type of role in the industry. I think something like that is maybe a happy, short to medium step, but maybe DAOs, as they get actually more decentralized and more autonomous and AI comes into the picture, this could even get more, change drastically from that. But I think that is a practical short step in the near future.
Matt, I really appreciate that perspective. And I would chime in here and say it's not necessarily, to clarify, and not necessarily centralized regulators that need to take care of this problem. But, as someone who understands incentive alignment thoroughly, both you and Dr. Nick, and I'd imagine based on his reactions, he shares this view. I think you're one of those people that is able to speak to the quality of a project and the alignment of incentives in that project such that it's secure, useful, valuable, and secure, the three principles of tokenomics, to check those boxes. And so I think I am hopeful that a conglomerate of people like the people in this space will arise to facilitate this kind of decentralized consumer reports, if only informally. Excuse me. On that topic, and I don't want to put you on the spot to recommend any particular projects, so this is not financial advice. This is purely the evaluation of an alignment of incentives in a particular project. I'm curious about what projects are interesting to you right now. Maybe these are unproven but interesting. They might be, sort of proven, have been around for a while. Feel free to go any direction you want with this. But what projects have some interesting tokenomic mechanisms, and can you unpack why those are interesting to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think like not necessarily a specific project, but one aspect that is interesting is Oracle free and related to that kind of governance free focus is something that I've noticed, growing narrative recently. I think a lot of exploits, a lot of hacks, a lot of, risk is taken on when you have a protocol that relies on an oracle that oftentimes is in theory decentralized, but is in practice much more centralized. And also, it's just introducing another external element that can and has historically had bugs, right? The oracle reports a much higher price due to some bug, and then suddenly people can mint a lot more money than they should be able to, and then you end up with insolvent protocols. So I think projects that are working on oracle free and or governance free aspects, liquidity, LUSD stablecoin is one of them. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this right, but Ajna Finance, AJNA Finance, is a project I've got an eye on, because they do Oracle-free borrowing and lending. So again, this, not financial advice. I'm not recommending someone go out and buy, native tokens for any of these protocols. Just mentioning what is interesting, and then. Mechanisms. I know you have some opinions, Nate, on controllers and that sort of stuff. But I think from an incentives point of view and feedback loop point of view, projects like Rye, which is another stable coin, are pretty interesting in how they are achieving their peg mechanism with feedback loops and driving incentives using basically an interest rate that fluctuates, can't even go negative, in order to sustainably hold the peg, or they don't really have an explicit peg, but just stay stable. Those are some concepts. I think you can think about maybe some others, but what do you I know you have some thoughts on controllers, Nate, so maybe you can give your own opinion about Rye or those topics.
Sure, yeah, and I'd even throw in High, which just launched its multi-collateral RAI, and Amin had some thoughts on how the controller should be changed, and that he's even said before ungovernance was a mistake to hard code the controller, the PID, and I think it's rather than this kind of harkens back to your point that it's impossible to really triangulate what the point of failure is in a complex system like this because it could be so many things. But my suspicion is the issue with Rye is not that it was hard coded; it's that there was an algorithm that was hard coded. It's not that it lacked governance; it's that it was an algorithm. So to me, hard coding an algorithm is just one step of abstraction up from hard coding a variable, but fundamentally people can still game the system, and given an infinity of time, all possible parameters will be tested in combination against a protocol, and if any one of those has an edge case, then there will be a vulnerability there that leads to either an exploit like we saw with Terra, or an externality, which is like could be an externality to the token price in the form of inflation, or a slow bleed down to zero, which is what Rye looks like it's headed toward. But both of so those are my thoughts on controllers and PID, PID controllers and algorithms that are hard coded into protocols. I am totally willing to have my mind changed on that, but it's just sort of my skew. So two things you mentioned there, though, the commonality. I guess the first one with Anja Finance, or however that's pronounced, is definitely an interesting trend. The Oracle-less protocols, and I'm tracking a few others pretty closely, and really interested to help anybody that's building something in an effort to minimize that Oracle dependency. The second thing that you pointed out, the commonality between Rye and Liquidity, is that they're both stable coins. And this is something else that I think is a really interesting thread and would love to get your opinion on. What do you see as the trade-offs in stablecoins? Like, what are those qualities that, if you have more of one, you necessarily have less of another? Or what are the considerations that these stablecoins are facing? How would you categorize those?
Yeah, I mean the classic stablecoin trilemma is choosing any two of the three of capital efficiency, centralization or decentralization, and basically peg stability. And I don't think anyone has cracked all three. Liquidity has a new version V2 coming out soon that they claim will crack all three. I'm not super optimistic from what I've seen so far, but open to seeing what they're working on. Of course, excited to see. But you basically can very easily get any two of the three, right? You can be decentralized and over collateralized like LUSD and hold your peg, or you can be decentralized and hold your peg, but not necessarily be able to sustain that because you're not collateralized, like we saw with some of these algorithmic coins that were under collateralized. So I think it's a hard balance, because even people forget that even DAI, Maker stablecoin, really struggled with holding peg, and largely wasn't holding its peg until they introduced the price stability module, aka introduce this gigantic liquidity pool of DAI USDC. And so DAI is just essentially inheriting its price stability by being exchangeable for this centralized stablecoin. And as soon as you censor or remove that centralized stablecoin, DAI itself would not hold pegs. So DAI is one of the reasons in exploring these other stablecoins, is because DAI has really become not, it's decentralized in name, but actually most of its value is now dependent or tied closely to centralized collateral and centralized stables. So not super bullish on DAI, that direction it's heading. I do think, though, some of the mechanisms that Maker has done recently for the Maker token, just in a vacuum, those tokenomics mechanisms are clever, and also advancements like their recent improvement to buyback and burn, where they now buy back and do things like provide liquidity, is definitely like I think an improvement from buyback and burn. Decreases price volatility, increases liquidity. So it's not to say that Maker's doing everything wrong, but it's a good. I think it's worthwhile recognizing that even projects that are doing something right or wrong, there's very rarely a project that's doing everything wrong or everything right. There's always something that can probably be tweaked, improved. And so I think it is an open question, Nate, to get back to like the PID stuff of like, yes, the hard-coded variable is very rarely good, but at some point, and an algorithm is an abstraction up from that, where there's still, a bonding curve, for example, is an example of like a very simplistic hard-coded algorithm that doesn't have flexibility, doesn't respond to, market dynamics. But at some point, it's hard to see how you can generalize, entirely generalize, right? When you design something, there's got to be some kind of algorithm that is the core of the protocol, no matter how simplified it is, right? Even if it's as simple as just being purely, cash, peer-to-peer cash payment, like Bitcoin itself, which is very, very simple relative to smart contract protocols, like modern smart contract protocols. There's still, algorithmic settings and decisions that Bitcoin has hard coded it effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a valid criticism of ungovernance and having something entirely self-referential. I think that the way that I describe it is, I think there are mechanisms that can be entirely self-referential to the system. I think Anja is working on that. There's another protocol that the name escapes me, but there was a talk in DeFi Prague on a protocol that's a lending protocol that uses an AMM, a native AMM for its own oracle. And so these are the kinds of things that I think we're going to start to see. But there's always the possibility that extra protocol incentives contaminate the incentives of those participants in the protocol. So example would be like, I don't want to use eigenlayer as an example, but the concern I have with eigenlayer is that it's going to create incentives outside of Ethereum. And I think this is a fair concern to have. It's going to create incentives outside of the Ethereum protocol that affect the security of Ethereum in a maybe more roundabout way. Not to digress in that direction, but okay. So if anyone else has any more questions, feel free to post those. We have I want to keep this to the hour or so, so another 10 minutes, or if any questions come in, a little toward the later end, then that's fine. We'll go a little bit over. But Matty, I wanted to ask you maybe one or two more questions. How do you think about, like, where do you start when you start designing a mechanism? And do you have an idea of like a sort of call it a formulaic approach to mechanism design? Like, what is your high level process, and how do you go about designing mechanisms for protocols?
Yeah, that's a great question. I appreciate it. I've basically developed a process, by iterating, trial and error, working with a number of teams, working on a number of projects, incorporating also their processes and feedback. But I think it's probably less exciting than people are hoping when they ask, how do you work with mechanism design and incentives and tokenomics, because it all sounds so fancy, and it is complicated. But let's not forget the basics, right? Just going back to square one of asking yourself, what is the objective I'm even trying to achieve, right? What is the objective I'm trying to design for? And then identifying what are the types of players or actors in that in this context, in this ecosystem. And those could be traders, buyers, sellers, right? Depending, borrowers, lenders, right? It's going to be context specific of what the types of agents are, and the agents and the roles that they play. And you always want to consider not just agents or roles that you like, but also that you don't like malicious actors, for example. And then you have to start thinking through the incentives, that how do you incentivize, or how could you incentivize each of these different parties with their own selfish motivations to work towards your desired collective goal. And then there's going to be inherently conflicts that arise during that mapping process of incentives of, yes, it in theory makes sense to incentivize, I don't know, party A to do this behavior, but that directly contradicts party B, right? Because maybe it's a marketplace where you in theory want to have as low as cost as possible for buyers so that more buyers come in, but that eats into the profit margin of sellers, and sellers are trying to maximize their profit margin. So now you're starting to identify specific kind of conflicts or specific elements that need to be optimized, right? That needs to be, there's never going to be a perfect answer, but there is a better or worse answer for the context and for the specific objectives you have. And so you start to, it's an iterative, messy kind of mapping process, thinking through this, stress testing it, doing qualitative, kind of game theory thought processes of trying to exploit it and break it, and then gradually formulating that into more quantitative expressions, spreadsheet, discrete modeling, stochastic modeling, and tools using languages like Python or whatever you prefer. So it evolves roughly in that way up until this point where you have this kind of stress tested system that it's important to recognize is never going to be perfect, right? There's no system in which there are choices that are right or wrong, but there's only choices that are better or worse given certain trade-offs, given a certain optimization function, and given a certain context. And so that's really how at least I approach it, how most systems engineers I meet approach it. There's not really some like magic bullet to it's not as simple as just whipping out some like game theory structure 2x2 table and then suddenly you have a sound tokenomics. It's a bit more messy and iterative than that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd say it's partly an art, not just a sorry, got distracted by the echo. More of an art than a science in a lot of ways, because this is an open-ended problem to be solved, right? It's not necessarily that you can apply some formulaic approach, and it gets very complex. And so I'd imagine it's and we know firsthand it's helpful to have a framework. And this is one of the things that I think people are really going to get out of your book is the insight in how to implement this kind of stuff, and also a link within that to your framework. We had one person. I have one more question from the audience, and then we had another person ask where they can get a hold of your book. So we'll close out with that. But the second to last question was on stablecoins. Someone from the audience, Mike, was curious about what your take on Curve USD and Frax are for the Frax USD from Frax Finance. Maybe you could speak to that, and then we'll close it out, and you can share where to get a hold of your ebook tomorrow.
Yeah, awesome. On the Frax side of things, I'm not 100% sure I'm up to date on what they've done. I know they were originally this like partially collateralized, right? Like they were, I believe it was like 80% collateralized by USDC, and then the rest collateralized by Frax, if I remember correctly. And I was not a fan of that design for the simple reason of 80% collateralized is a lot better than 0% collateralized, but it's still collateralized by this native token that is going to be volatile, that there's no fundamental reason it's going to be there as a value to back the value of the stable coin. And so I think it was very wise that the Frax community saw what happened to Terra Luna UST, realized that it would it would take even a more substantial kind of move because the coin is 80% collateralized, which is a lot more collateralized than UST was, but that it was inevitable that the same kind of dynamic would play out and move to be 100% backed. So I don't know if they're doing something similar to what Curve USD is doing, but that's what I think of Frax, at least to my knowledge. Curve USD is very interesting in that they're doing this dynamic of basically hedging, dynamically hedging the holdings between the risky asset, i.e. the collateral asset, and the stable asset. And so in theory, if we ignore like trading costs and slippage and fees and all these actual inefficiencies of the real world, you would be able to like perfectly hedge, price moves in order to when the collateral asset is falling in price, you are 100% in the stable asset, so you're fine. And conversely, when the collateral asset is increasing, you are back to your allocate your optimal allocation. I think the devil is in the details, and it remains to be seen how that will work in actual practice in different market conditions, because these aspects of hedging are highly dependent on the realized costs, slippage, fees, spreads that you can get. And market mechanics can radically change from one day to the next. Bear market conditions are very different than a bull market conditions, flash crashes, etc., like all these things. So I am, I'm not in I'm not super in love with how dependent it is on some of these assumptions, but I think it's an interesting dynamic, and it is theoretically sound. It's just how much will the inefficiencies of the real world actually prove to be a friction on it. So I'd expect there to be some kind of like drag over time that would lead to it kind of losing peg in a vacuum, all else equal, that could potentially be replaced by some kind of fee mechanism or some kind of revenue mechanism that's replacing the drag with some sustainable increase of the thing backing the asset. But those are some thoughts.
Really deep insight there, and I'd imagine only a handful of people in the audience are familiar with the llama mechanism that Curve USD uses. But I agree with you in that this particular mechanism works in theory, and we'll see. It has yet to prove its longevity in practice. But yeah, that was sort of my first thought too. Was maybe there could be like a 1 to 3% fee that might cover the kind of gas fees that arbitrageurs are supposed to take on in that model. That's very deep insight for anybody listening. I think this is a masterclass in financial engineering and in the depth of understanding of tokenomics. And so I think it's very fitting that Matty is putting out this resource for builders tomorrow. It's called Tokenomics for Builders. And Matty, I'll let you share where this will be available, how people can get in touch with you, and what what you're interested in helping builders with. Feel free to shill and share what you're working on and interested in, would like to help people with.
Thanks, Nate. I appreciate that. So tomorrow, the guide will go open source. I'll be doing a brief spaces as well. Again, hope to see you there tomorrow, Nate. And following that, I think that's going to happen at like 10:30 Eastern time. And then following that, I'm going to push send, send out a thread with a link to the guide. It will also be linked, in the link in my Twitter bio. So anyone looking for it, if you're listening to this recording after the fact, you can always find it, via my profile. It'll be open source. It's a Notion-based document, so people will be able to always, access it. In terms of what the guide represents, it's like I said, it's available to all. It's a accumulation or amalgamation of a lot of lessons from my personal experience, but also, it's been stress tested, early readers, feedback from people like Nate, from people at the Tokenomics DAO, from people at Token Engineering Commons, from other professionals, from builders, from teams and accelerators, teams and incubators. So I'm hoping that it'll be a very useful, valuable guide to teams. Not every team raises VC money or can afford to professionally hire full-time employees or even part-time employees to work on their tokenomics. So I'm hoping that for less well-funded, smaller teams, this is a very valuable resource that can help them do it themselves. And for more funded teams that need more even custom expertise or advice, this could potentially point them in the right direction to people like Nate, or myself when I have bandwidth. These days I'm mostly focused on status and logos, so don't have a ton of bandwidth. But but I hope it is, it treats all these different parties with their respective needs, because as you get more advanced, there is a lot of devil in the detail, a lot of nuance, as we've mentioned. This like Curve USD, stablecoin is a great example of that. There's so much complexity in even something that is seemingly simple at the surface, right? Something that's a stable coin sounds simple enough, but there's actually a ton of complexity behind the scenes. So there's always more, always deeper to dive into the rabbit hole. But this guide is meant to be a really solid foundation to get you up to speed with what you need to know from a builder's perspective, and also point you in the right direction should you need to go even deeper.
Excellent. And Matty will be posting this on his profile, no doubt, tomorrow when it's released. We are also holding a Twitter space tomorrow morning. Matty and I will be discussing. Matty's hosting a Twitter space. I'll be joining, and we'll be discussing tokenomics in general, best practices, and talking about this new ebook that is completely free. So make sure to get a hold of that. Highly encourage everyone to read it, and follow Matty to stay tuned on this book and for more updates on tokenomics.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nate.
Matty, it's been a pleasure to have you on today. Thanks so much for talking and for answering all the audience questions. Appreciate everyone else for joining in, and really looking forward to having everybody back next week and seeing you all tomorrow, hopefully on our call in the morning. I guess my morning. But tomorrow at, let's see, 9:30 Eastern time. Am I getting that right?
10:30 Eastern.
10:30 Eastern time.
Yeah.
Mixing time zones here. Mad life. Great. Well, looking forward to talking with you tomorrow, Matty, and seeing that book in its full form. Really excited for the release of Tokenomics for Builders tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much, everybody, for coming on and asking these great questions. Looking forward to talking with you all soon.